again thankful for each one who's here with us this evening. I was talking to Zach just before services. There have been about 100 homes that have been lost in a wildfire. So let's remember those families and those who continue to battle those fires throughout Oklahoma. Our text this evening comes from 2 Chronicles chapter 25. 2 Chronicles chapter 25, looking at what can happen if we do not have a loyal heart for God. 2 Chronicles chapter 25, looking at verses 1 and 2. The Bible says, Amaziah was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoaddan of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a loyal heart. And it's interesting to me that the Bible makes a distinction of doing what was right in the sight of God and doing it with a loyal heart. As we see in verse 2, obviously we will recognize, as we continue to go through this, that something's going to change in this man's life at some point, because he's not going to be loyal to God. As the Bible points out there in verse 2, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, so he was doing some things that were right, doing what God commanded, but obviously he's going to forsake God at some point. As we see, the Bible says, but not with a loyal heart. If someone is loyal, it means they don't ever turn away from Him. It's like having a loyal pet. They never run away from you. You never have to go and chase it down across the neighborhood, across the town. It's always where it should be. And we see here Amaziah was not one who was loyal to God throughout all of his life, because there's going to come a time, as we continue to read, that he's going to forsake God and not be loyal to Him as he ought to. We are loyal to many things in this life, jobs, families, personal hobbies, and things of that nature. Yet how loyal are we to God? Do we have the same loyalty to God as we would have to perhaps our families or to our jobs? Let's look now at the same chapter, 2 Chronicles 25, and we'll look at verses 3 through 5. And we'll go back to the very beginning and see how God, as He always does, has kept His end, as we say sometimes, His end of the bargain. He has done what He wanted to do with Amaziah, but Amaziah does not keep his end of the deal. Looking at verse 3 through 5, the Bible says, Now it happened, as soon as the kingdom was established for him, that he executed his servants who had murdered his father the king. However, he did not execute their children, but did as it was written, or as was written in the law of the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, saying, The father shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall their children be put to death for their fathers, but a person shall die for his own sin. Moreover, Amaziah gathered Judah together and set over them captains of thousands and captains of hundreds, according to their fathers and houses, throughout all of Judah and Benjamin. And he numbered them from 20 years old and above, and found them to be 300,000 choice men able to go to war, who could handle spear and shield. Amaziah was a man, as we see here as a leader, has a grand army. One of the best things you can have as a leader is an army that can protect you, protect your nation, and if it needs to be, go to war. And we see there in verse 5, the Bible says, And found them to be 300,000 choice men. I mean, they weren't just your average soldier. They weren't just men who could do the most basic task. They were choice men, able to go to war, who could handle spear and shield. They were men hardened and ready to go to battle. And we see here in verse 25, you had 300,000 choice men who could do that on his behalf. He was a man who was going to be able to take care of his nation, or take care of his kingdom, and to go to war if necessary. Amaziah accomplished much with God on his side. We see here he has a grand army. The man must realize with God on our side, we will be blessed. When God is with us and we're doing things that are pleasing in the sight of God, and strive to say within His Word, God will take care of us. Look, if you will, at verse 6. How Amaziah follows the advice of a prophet once, but he doesn't do it twice. And looking at verse 6, he also hired 100,000 mighty men of valor from Israel for 100 talents of silver. Now here's the problem. He has all these choice men, but then he goes out and hires more men. And notice verse 7. But a man of God came to him, saying, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you. The Lord is not with Israel, not with any of the children of Ephraim. So you have this grand army. They're going to ruin everything if you go and hire these men from Israel, because God is not with them. Do not hire these men. In verse 8, but if you go, be gone. If you're going to go and do it, go and do it now, because the outcome's going to be the same, unless you send these people away. Even so, God shall make you fall before the enemy, for God has power to help and to overthrow. Then Amaziah said to the man of God, But what shall we do about the 100 talents which I have given to the troops of Israel? Isn't it interesting that even during this time, men were concerned with money? What shall I do about all this money I spent on all these men, all these soldiers coming? Basically, we see in here, and he tells them, big deal, God will give you more than that. Just send these men away. In verse 8, the man of God answered, The Lord is able to give you much more than this. Forget about the money, God will take care of that. Just send them away. Verse 10. So Amaziah discharged the troops that had come to him from Ephraim to go back home. Therefore their anger was greatly aroused against Judah, and they returned home in great anger. So he's out all this money, and he's made a group of men, as we see there in verse 6, of 100,000 mighty men of valor from Israel. He's upset all of them. Not a good idea, but he still has one important factor. He has God on his side. He may have lost all this money, he may have upset these men from Israel, but God, because he has done so, because he has heeded the advice of the prophet, sent these men away, God is still going to be with him, because he has obeyed the prophet from God at this point. In verse 11, then Amaziah strengthened himself, and leading his people, he went to the valley of Salt and killed 10,000 of the people of Seir. Also the children of Judah took captive 10,000 alive, brought them to the top of the rock, cast them down to the top of the rock, so they all were dashed in pieces. He was victorious without the men of Israel. He was victorious because God was with him at this point. Look with me, if you will, at Proverbs chapter 12. We'll be coming back to 2 Chronicles, but look with me at Proverbs chapter 12. In Proverbs chapter 12, and looking with me at verse 15. In Proverbs 12 and verse 15. The Bible says, The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. There's times we can, disregard advice and still be okay. There's times we have to heed godly advice. Because there's godly advice and there's ungodly advice. And with Amaziah there in 2 Chronicles 25, he was giving godly advice from a prophet of God. And we see here in verse 15, he who heeds counsel is wise. It's always a good idea to find godly men or godly woman, whatever the case may be, to give you godly advice. Because there comes times that we really aren't too sure about what we should or shouldn't be doing. And it never hurts, as we see here in verse 15, to ask for godly advice. He who heeds counsel is wise. And for Amaziah here, the counsel he was seeking, or he was following, was the counsel of the prophet of God. So he hired these warriors, however they were not needed. This is what the prophet tells him, send them away, because God will not be with them. You'll lose your battle if they're with you. They'll just cause you to lose instead. So he sends them away. And here this man follows godly advice and is blessed because he goes to war and he is successful. He is victorious. His attitude, however, quickly changes when he gains victory. We stop in verse 12, but look back now at verse 14 of 2 Chronicles 25. 2 Chronicles 25 and verse 14, the Bible says, Now it was so after Amaziah came from the slaughter of the Edomites that he brought the gods of the people of Seir to set them up to be his gods, and bowed down before them and burned incense to them. What did he just do? He took the gods of the people he just defeated, he just crushed, and he made their gods, he couldn't deliver them, to be his gods. Look again now at verse 14. Now it was so after Amaziah came from, now notice the Bible describes the victory from the slaughter of the Edomites. That's how big his victory was. It was described as a slaughter. Now he comes from that victory, he takes their gods, the people, and he sets them up, as the Bible says in verse 14, to be his gods. And he bowed down before them and burned incense to them. Now notice what happened in verse 15. Therefore the angel of the Lord was aroused against Amaziah, and he sent him a prophet who said to him, Why have you sought the gods of the people who could not rescue their own people from your hand? It's like going to the Olympics are going on. I'll give you this illustration. And you see an Olympic team that's just destroyed in a certain event. And you go and you recruit them to be your coach. Why would you do that? Why would you follow after someone who's just been devastated by another group? That's what's going on here with Amaziah. He has destroyed these people, and he takes their gods and did nothing for them, as the Bible points out in verse 15, and he makes them his gods. Look again at verse 15, the latter part of verse 15. Why have you sought the gods of the people which could not rescue their own people from your hand? Why would you seek after gods that can do nothing? They cannot help you, because you just destroyed the people who are following this God. In verse 16, so it was as he talked with them that the king said to him, Have we made you the king's counselor? Cease. You notice there are certain things that have changed in Amaziah's character. Number one, he's become arrogant. He's allowed his victory to make him believe that he is now to do pretty much whatever he wants to. That's why he has taken out, at least what appears to be, why he has taken these idols or these gods and make them his own gods. We see in verse 16, notice how he speaks to a prophet of God. And we know he's a prophet because what happened when the prophet warned him the first time about the men from Israel? He obeyed him and he was victorious. He got the victory that he's just experienced. Now, though, when the prophet tells him, in verse 15, why are you following these gods? Look at a response to this prophet of God. Have you made you the king's counselor? It sounds a lot like Cain in Genesis, doesn't it? Who am I my brother's keeper? Sounds very similar. And we see here in verse 16, have you made you the king's counselor? Cease. Why should you be killed? So he doesn't just let him be quiet, he threatens to kill a prophet of God. What was the prophet of God warning him about? That he's going to die for what he's doing. He's going to lose not just his life, but also his soul if he did not stop what he was doing. In verse 16, and the prophet ceased and said, notice he's quiet for a moment, but he makes one final plea. I know that God has determined to destroy you, because you have done this and have not heeded my advice. You know, the advice he was giving Amaziah wasn't just some worldly advice. It wasn't advice about the stock market or about trades or buying a car or house. His advice was of eternal consequence. And notice what he says in verse 16 before he's finally quiet. He said, I know that God has determined to destroy you. He's not talking just about taking his life. He's talking about God's going to take your soul. We see in verse 16, because you have done this and have not heeded my advice. Whose advice was it? Whose warning was it really? It was God's. It was coming through the prophet, but it was God's advice warning him, do not do this. Look with me at Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. His victory caused arrogance in his heart. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, looking at verse 17 through verse 20. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. You know that's probably what Amaziah was thinking. It's my power that's done this. It's my power that's given me this victory over these people. In verse 18, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant with which He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. This shall be if you by any means, now notice verse 19, if you by any means forget the Lord your God. You know, that goes right along with Amaziah not having a loyal heart for God, because he has forgotten God. That's why he's telling the prophet to be quiet, to cease, unless you also be killed, because he has forgotten what God has done for him. The reason Amaziah was in the position he was currently in It's because of God. He's the one who